Like all trading card games, Magic prioritized trying to make cards as easy to read and understand as possible. This is really important for being able to attract new players to the game. However, Magic still has some cards that, despite Wizards' best efforts, are extremely hard to understand. So today we're going to go over some of the cards with the hardest to parse card text. Starting us off at number 10, we have Animate Dead. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has Enchant Creature in a Graveyard and the ability where, when Animate Dead enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield it loses Enchant Creature in a Graveyard and gains Enchant Creature put onto the battlefield with Animate Dead. Then you return Enchant Creature card to the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. When Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, the creature's controller sacrifices it. And finally, the enchanted creature gets -1, -0. Now, the funny thing about this card is that it's actually really easy to explain in common language, but kind of requires this extremely roundabout rules text to work. The card is basically identical to cards like Premature Burial and Yu-Gi-Oh!, but due to the rule differences between the two games, the Magic version has to go through way more hoops to work. Auras have two important uses that come up here. One, all auras need to target something as you cast them, and if an aura isn't attached to anything, you have to put it into the graveyard. The card can't just reanimate a creature when it enters the battlefield without being attached to anything, because it both needs a target to be cast and has to be attached to something to stay on the battlefield. So it has to enchant something as it's cast, then switch to enchanting something else after it's entered the battlefield trigger. This adds a ton of rules text that doesn't actually change the function of the card, but it has to be there for the card to work in the rules. The worst part of all of this is that Animate Dead, unlike a lot of the other cards in this list, is really good and sees a ton of play in every format where it's legal. Meaning not only is this card difficult to parse, it's also something you're going to run into eventually. A lot of players have probably gone through the experience of casting an Animate Dead with a newer player at the table and realizing with a sense of dread they're going to have to explain to them how the card works. This is made even worse if you're using an older version of the card with even less clear rules text. Animate Dead is overly wordy, but what it does is pretty straightforward and easy to do once you understand, which isn't true of a lot of other cards higher up on this list. And at number 9, we have Pyramids. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 6. It has the ability where you can pay 2 to choose 1. You can either destroy target aura attached to a land, or the next time target land would be destroyed this turn, you instead remove all damage from it. Of course, if you have a copy of Pyramids, it won't say any of this. The card was only printed once all the way back in Arabian Nights and simply hasn't received another printing. Pyramids is here representing pretty much the entire early era of the game, where even the simplest of card effects often had extremely strange wording, not to mention the wording is completely untenable with the current rules of the game. The original text of Pyramids just said prevents one land from being destroyed or removes any enchantment from any land. This has a few issues. For one, it doesn't tell you if it targets anything. It doesn't tell you how it prevents the destruction of the land, and removes an enchantment from a land is ambiguous. Does it destroy the aura or does it simply unattach it? Both make sense with this early wording. The reason Pyramids was chosen as the poster child for this era of weird card text is that its current Oracle text is also strange, though it does make sense when you think about it. The card text, the next time target land would be destroyed this turn, instead remove all damage from it, makes a lot of players take a double take when they first read it. After all, lands can't be damaged. In order for them to take damage, you'd have to turn them into a different card type first. This is possible, of course, and actually a pretty important part of the card effect. If you have a card like Life and Limb to turn your lands into creatures and they get damaged, and Pyramids doesn't remove damage as part of its effect, the effect wouldn't be able to save the land. It would prevent destruction once, but then the damage would kick in and kill it again. So the card has to remove damage as well. Since we're going for a replacement effect, the easiest way to write this is replacing destruction with removing all damage. This is how we end up with this reasonable, but initially confusing card text. And at number 8, we have Benediction of Moons. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 white. It has the effect where you gain 1 life for each player. It has Haunt, meaning when this spell resolves, instead of putting it into your graveyard, you exile it and target creature. And when the creature this card is haunting dies, you gain 1 life for each player. Benediction is here representing the entire Haunt keyword, as Haunt is one of the least clear and most easily misunderstood keywords Wizards has ever rolled out. The first issue is that Haunt actually works differently based on what kind of card it's on. While on instants and sorceries like Benediction, it triggers as the card resolves. On permanent spells like Absolve or Thrall, it triggers when the creature dies. The way the keyword works is that you basically get to have an effect when you cast a spell or when a creature of your choice dies, though the hoops you have to jump through to get there change based on which card you're using. Benediction is on here specifically because the effect they choose for this particular card is also a bit weird. You very rarely see cards that scale just based on the number of players in the game. It feels like a part of the text is just absent, like it was supposed to count the number of players with cards in their hand or something similar. And before we move on, it's worth pointing out that the card is simply terrible. 1 mana to gain 4 life is already terrible, and having to wait for a creature to die to gain half of that really feels like Wizards is kicking you while you're down. And at number 7, we have Takklemaggot. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has Enchant Creature and the abilities where, at the beginning of the upkeep of Enchanted Creature's controller, put a -0/-1 counter on the creature. When an enchanted creature dies, the creature's controller chooses a creature that Takklemaggot could enchant. If the player does, return Takklemaggot to the battlefield under your control attached to that creature. If they don't, return Takklemaggot to the battlefield under your control as a non-aura enchantment. It loses enchant creature and gains, at the beginning of the player's upkeep, Takklemaggot deals 1 damage to that player. This is another card that's a victim of the strict rules around how auras work. But unlike Animate Dead, the card's effect is also just really convoluted. First off, it's one of the few cards in the game that uses power and toughness changing counters that aren't +1/+1 or -1/-1 counters. This used to happen a lot more in the olden days of Magic, but Wizards has since abandoned the practice, and for good reason. Having to track these counters alongside +1/+1 counters is a huge headache, especially since the ruling where +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters cancel each other out doesn't work with any other types of counters. Basically, how Takklemaggot works is that at the beginning of the player's upkeep, they put a -0/-1 counter on the creature, and when it dies, the enchantment hops onto another creature if there's no one on the field. If it can't, it basically attaches itself to you and deals 1 damage to you each turn. Honestly, if the card was more recent, the last bit would probably be removed. It's an unnecessary downside that complicates the card's effect far too much for how much text it forced them to add. Ultimately, the card has a convoluted effect that requires an even more convoluted text box to communicate. And at number 6, we have Dead Ringers. This is a sorcerer with the mana cost of 4 and 1 black. It has the effect where you destroy 2 target non-black creatures unless either one is a color the other one isn't. Those creatures can't be regenerated. Now, the effect of Dead Ringers can be explained in a more clear way, but not without making the card text extremely complicated. Basically, here's how the card works. You target 2 creatures. You check to see if either of them are black creatures. Then you check to see if they're exactly the same color of colors. If they are, you destroy them. Otherwise, the card does nothing. So it can kill 2 red creatures or 2 blue-white creatures or anything like that. But it can't kill 2 black creatures or a blue and a blue-red creature. If you check everything in a list like this, it's pretty easy to figure out what it can and can't do. But the wording on the card is just awful. I don't know why they didn't say something like destroy 2 target non-black creatures that are exactly the same colors. Instead, the card uses a series of double negatives that require the player to untangle them to understand the card's effects. Dead Ringers is a bit of an infamous card. The heads of Wizards' design team have come out on a few occasions and said that they regret the card's design and wording, and it's a bit of a running joke in the community. However, the card has managed to be one of the hardest to read cards in the game with only 18 words of effects text. And at number 5, we have Chains of Mephistopheles. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It is the ability where, if a player would draw a card, except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, that player discards a card instead. If the player discards a card this way, they draw a card. And if the player doesn't discard a card this way, they mill a card. This is another infamous card, to the point where people have made flowcharts explaining how the card works. Actually, we should probably just use one of those to explain what it does. Basically, whenever you draw a card, you ask a series of questions. If it's your draw step, you ask if you've drawn another card this draw step. If you haven't, you draw a card. If it isn't your draw step and you've already drawn a card this draw step, you ask the next question. Do you have any cards in hand? If you have no cards in hand, you mill a card. If you do have cards in hand, you discard a card and then draw a card. Chains is in the same camp as Animate Dead, insofar as it's actually a really good card. Cards like Brainstorm are some of the best cards in Legacy, and Chains is pretty back-breaking to anyone trying to cast draw spells. The funny thing is, there are tons of cards with similar effects, like Narset, Parter of Veils, and their abilities are very easy to parse. The main issue is how many contingencies are baked into the card. If it just stopped the draw entirely or always milled, it would be so much easier to read. But due to having 3 separate outcomes, the card ends up reading like a mess. Wizards seems to have learned from their mistake, and word cards with similar effects in a way more intuitive way nowadays. And at number 4, we have Remove Enchantments. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 white. It has the effect where you return to your hand all enchantments you both own and control, all auras you own attached to permanents you control, and all auras you own attached to attacking creatures your opponent controls. Then destroy all other enchantments you control, all other auras attached to permanents you control, and all other auras attached to attacking creatures your opponent controls. This card is a complete headache to read. That's mostly because it does a ton of things that are almost identical but slightly different. The card basically wants you to get rid of all enchantments on your side of the board, including the auras you control but don't own, and all auras you own but don't control. For anyone who's confused, owning a card refers to whose deck the card belongs to, while controlling is just that, the player who controls it. The card also wants to get rid of the auras on your cards that you don't have anything to do with, and auras on your opponent's cards for good measure. The card is just doing too many things that are too similar. The card refers to no less than 6 different categories of enchantments on the board and gives you different instructions for them. Really, the card should just say something like, return all enchantments you control and all auras attached to permanents you control to their owner's hands. This is a change to the card's effect, but it's also a card that people could read and understand what's supposed to happen when they cast it. This is an errata to the card's text, but I really don't understand why the original version seemed like a good idea at the time either. Remove Enchantments is the only card on this list that gets here through pure word vomit. And at number 3, we have Raging River. This is an enchant with a mana cost of 2 red. It is the ability where, whenever one or more creatures you control attack, each defending player divides all creatures without flying they control into a left pile and a right pile. Then for each attacking creature you control, choose left or right. The player can't be blocked this combat except by creatures with flying and creatures in a pile with the chosen label. Of course, this is the updated card text, which isn't nearly as good as the original version of the card's text. The original version was a lot more difficult to parse, and referred to dividing cards up on sides of the river, as if the river were a physical object on the battlefield where the cards were being placed. Basically, whenever you attack, your opponent has to divide all of their blockers into 2 piles. Then you get to choose which pile of blockers you attack into, though their flying creatures get to ignore this entirely. This is another card very emblematic of early Magic card design, where flavor was regularly favored over mechanics. River doesn't do all that much, as it's only really good when the board is already really gummed up with creatures. However, the mechanic does capture the flavor of 2 forces being split along a river really well. It even ignores flying creatures who could freely fly from one battle to the other. As cute as this is, it does take quite a bit of legwork to get at what the card's getting at, even with the errata clearing up their rules text. And at number 2, we have Ice Cauldron. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 4. It is the ability where you can pay X and tap it to exile a non-land card from your hand. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. Put a charge counter on Ice Cauldron and note the type and amount of mana spent to pay the activation cost. You can activate this ability only if there are no charge counters on Ice Cauldron. You can tap or remove a charge counter from Ice Cauldron to add the last noted amount of type of mana for Ice Cauldron, and you can only spend this mana to cast the last card exiled with Ice Cauldron. Basically, what the card does is let you store a card for later use and save up some mana to help you cast it. Well, the premise sounds pretty simple. Trying to write it out in a way that makes sense to someone at first glance is pretty impossible, especially if you want to keep track of things like color and whether or not the mana you spent was snow mana. There are versions of the effect that have worked, such as the foretell mechanic. However, to get this to work, they need to do things like set a specific cost for you to pay later, which makes the mechanic a lot easier to parse at first glance. This is all made worse by the memory issues with Ice Cauldron. Since you have to track such specific information, playing with Ice Cauldron ends up being leaps and bounds more difficult to understand its effects in the abstract. As much of a headache as Ice Cauldron is, there's one card that's far more confusing to figure out how it works, to such a degree that there isn't even a consensus on what the card does. And at number 1, we have Season of the Witch. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 black. It has the abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice it unless you pay 2 life. At the beginning of the end step, you destroy each untapped creature that didn't attack this turn, except for creatures that couldn't attack. This is the poster child of cards with effects that just don't really tell you what they actually do. What exactly is a creature that could or couldn't attack? It may seem obvious, but it very quickly becomes a huge headache to think about. A creature with summoning sickness is pretty obvious, but adding additional modifiers makes it very confusing. If there's a silent arbiter on the battlefield, making it so that only one creature could attack that turn, are all other creatures considered having been able to attack or not? If a creature with haste enters the battlefield after the combat phase, would it be a creature that was able to attack this turn? If your opponent controls a card like Ghostly Prison, does that change what creatures are considered able or unable to attack? The rulings on this card don't make things much better. According to Gatherer, it only checks creatures that were there during the declared attacker step, which helps with the one question. Here's the issue. In the Magic comprehensive rules, there just isn't a definition of what a creature that could attack this turn is. There are answers for similar questions, but the language is not defined anywhere. When language is unclear like this, we default to plain text reading of a card effect, as in, what does this mean in the English language? However, there's still not really consensus on what this means in several situations. For example, if Season of the Witch and Silent Arbiter are on the battlefield, there's no official ruling for what's supposed to happen when Season of the Witch triggers. If this interaction comes up in a tournament, it's basically just whatever the head judge for that event says that goes. This is one of the few cards in Magic whose rules text is so unclear as to actually cause massive ruling issues, and is without a doubt the Magic card with the most confusing rules text. Alright, and that's the list. Are there the cards that you think we may have missed that might have fit this theme, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.